Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, actually. I'm Karen Dubin from Sweet Institute, and I'm going to be continuing on in our reading of Carl Rogers on Becoming a Person. We're going to start off on page 41 with the question, and then continue on to the end of page 44. And we're going to start with the question and then move to the answers given by research. So here we go. The question: but what are the characteristics of those relationships which do help, which do facilitate growth? And at the other end of the scale, is it possible to discern those characteristics which make a relationship unhelpful, even though it was the sincere intent to promote growth and development? It is to these two questions, particularly the first, that I would like to take you with me over some of the paths I have explored, and to tell you where I am, as of now, in my thinking on these issues. The answers given by research. It is natural to ask, first of all, whether there is any empirical research which would give us an objective answer to these questions. There has not been a large amount of research in this area as yet, but what there is stimulating and suggestive. I cannot report all of it, but I would like to make somewhat extensive sampling of the studies which have been done, and state very briefly some of the findings. In doing so, oversimplification is necessary, and I'm quite aware that I'm not doing full justice to the researches I am mentioning, but it may give you the feeling that factual advances are being made and pique your curiosity enough to examine the studies themselves if you have not already done so. Studies of attitudes. Most of the studies throw light on attitudes on part of the helping person, which make a relationship growth promoting or growth inhibiting. Let's look at some of these. A careful study of parent-child relationships made some years ago by Baldwin and others at the Fields Institute contains interesting evidence. Of the various clusters of parental attitudes toward children, the acceptance democratic seemed most growth facilitating. Children of these parents, with their warm and equalitarian attitudes, showed an accelerated intellectual development and increasing IQ, more originality, more emotional security and control, less excitability than children from other types of homes. Though somewhat slow initially in social development, they were, by the time they reached school age, popular, friendly, non-aggressive leaders. Where parents' attitudes are classed as actively rejectant, the children show a slightly decelerated intellectual development, relatively poor use of the abilities they do possess, and some lack of originality. They are emotionally unstable, rebellious, aggressive, and quarrelsome. The children of parents with other attitude syndromes tend to, in various respects, to fall in between these two extremes. I am sure that these findings do not surprise us as related to child development. I would like to suggest that they probably apply to other relationships as well, and that the counselor or physician or administrator who is warmly emotional and expressive, respectful of the individuality of himself and of the other, and who exhibits a non-possessive caring probably facilitates self-realization, much as does a parent with these attitudes. Let me turn to another careful study in a very different area. Whitehorn and Betts investigated the degree of success achieved by young resident physicians in working with schizophrenic patients on a psychiatric ward. They chose for special study the 7 who had been outstandingly helpful and 7 whose patients had shown the least degree of improvement. Each group had treated about 50 patients. The investigators examined all the available evidence to discover in what ways the Group A, the successful group, differed from Group B. Several significant differences were found. The physicians in Group A tended to see the schizophrenic in terms of the personal meaning which various behaviors had to the patient, rather than seeing him as a case history or a descriptive diagnosis. They also tended to work toward goals which were oriented to the personality of the patient rather than such goals as reducing the symptoms or curing the disease. It was found that the helpful physicians in their day-by-day interaction primarily made use of active personal participation, a person-to-person relationship. They made less use of procedures which could be classed as passive-permissive. They were even less likely to use such procedures as interpretation, instruction, or advice, or emphasis on the practical care of the patient. Finally, they were much more likely than Group B to develop a relationship in which the patient felt trust and confidence in the physician. Although the authors cautiously emphasize that these findings relate only to the treatment of schizophrenics, I am inclined to disagree. I suspect that similar facts would be found in a research study of almost any class of helping relationship. Another interesting study focuses on the way in which the person being helped perceives the relationship. Hine studied individuals who had gone for psychotherapeutic help to psychoanalytics, client-centered, and Adlerian therapists. Regardless of the type of therapy, these clients report similar changes in themselves. But it is their perception of the relationship which is of particular interest to us here. When asked what accounted for the changes which had occurred, they expressed some differing explanations, depending on the orientation of the therapist, but their agreement on the major elements had found helpful, but their agreement on the major elements they had found helpful was even more significant. They indicated that these attitudinal elements in the relationship accounted for the changes which had taken place in themselves, the trust they had felt with the therapist, being understood by the therapist, the feeling of independence they had in making choices and decisions. The therapist procedure which they found most helpful was that the therapist clarified and openly stated feelings which the client had been approaching hazily and hesitantly. There was also a high degree of agreement among these clients, regardless of the orientation of their therapists, as to what elements had been unhelpful in the relationship. Such therapist attitudes as lack of interest, remoteness, or distance, and an over degree of sympathy were perceived as unhelpful. As to the procedures, they had found it unhelpful when therapists had given direct advice regarding decisions or had emphasized past history rather than present problems. Guiding suggestions mildly given were perceived in an intermediate range, neither clearly helpful nor unhelpful. Feidler, in a much-quoted study, found that expert therapists on differing orientations found similar relationships with their clients. Less well known are the elements which characterize these relationships, differing them from relationships formed by less expert therapists. These elements are an ability to understand the client's meanings and feelings, a sensitivity to the client's attitudes, a warm interest without any emotional over-involvement. A study by Quinn throws light on what is involved in understanding the client's meanings and feelings. His study is surprising in that it shows that understanding of the client's meanings is essentially an attitude of desiring to understand. Quinn presented his judges only with recorded therapist statements from the interviews. The raters had no knowledge of what the therapist was responding to or how the client reacted to his response. Yet it was found that the degree of understanding could be judged about as well from the material as from listening to the response in the context. This seems rather conclusive evidence that it is an attitude of wanting to understand which is communicated. As to the emotional quality of the relationship, Seaman found that success in psychotherapy is closely associated with a strong and growing mutual liking and respect between client and therapist. An interesting study by Dietz indicated how delicate this relationship is. Using a physiological measure, the psychogalvanic reflex, to measure the anxious or threatened or alerted reactions of the client. Dietz correlated the deviations on this measure with the judge's ratings of the degree of warm acceptance and permissiveness on the part of the therapist. It was found that whenever the therapist's attitudes changed even slightly in the direction of a lesser degree of acceptance, the number of abrupt GSR deviations significantly increased. Evidently, when the relationship is experienced as less acceptant, the organism organizes against threat, even at the physiological level. Without trying to fully integrate the findings from these various studies, it can at least be noted that a few things stand out. One is the fact that it is the attitudes and feelings of the therapist rather than his theoretical orientation which is important. His procedures and techniques are less important than his attitudes. It is also worth noting that it is the way in which his attitudes and procedures are perceived which makes a difference to the client, and that it is this perception which is crucial. So that is the end of the reading for today. Thank you all so much. Tomorrow we are going to continue on with manufactured relationships on the top of 45. And have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your Thursday. Some really interesting reading. And we look forward to seeing you all again soon.